Okay, hello everyone. It's 12 o'clock, so we're going to start the CLE. My name's David Christie. I'm the chair for the CPD section for the Yukon Law Society, and that's where we're broadcasting from, the Yukon Law Society here in Whitehorse. Today I'm pleased to introduce the speakers for today's CPD course, which is called Applying a Child's Rights Lens, Lessons from the Child and Youth Advocate. First, I'll introduce Annette King. She is the Yukon Child and Youth Advocate and the Vice President of the Canadian Council of Child and Youth Advocates. She was sworn in by the Yukon Legislative Assembly in 2015 and has recently been reappointed for a second 5-year term. She was born and raised in the Yukon, and Ms. King has dedicated her 25 plus years in social work, clinical and leadership roles with the Yukon government. Ms. King has also taught as a sessional instructor in the Bachelor of Social Work program at Yukon College. She is dedicated to upholding children's rights with a focus on reconciliation. She was the 2020 Yukon recipient of the Canadian Association of Social Workers Award for Distinguished Service. And she has a social work diploma from Red Deer College and a Bachelor of Social Work degree and Masters of Social Work degrees from the University of Calgary. Our other speaker is Shauna Steichman. She's a lawyer here in the Yukon, and she obtained her BA honors from McGill University in 2002 and her LLB from the University of Victoria in 2006. After clerking for the Supreme Court of British Columbia, she was called to the bar in BC in 2009 and then called to the Yukon bar in 2011. She has appeared before the Federal Court of Canada, the Tax Court of Canada, the Supreme Court of British Columbia, and the Supreme Court and Territorial Courts of the Yukon. Shauna manages her own practice, specializing in family law, civil litigation, human rights law, Indigenous law, and administrative law. I'm going to be passing this Zoom over to Annette and Shauna, but I will say that following the presentation, there'll be a segment for questions and answers, which you can type your questions in the chat box, and the speakers will do their best to answer. Okay, thank you and enjoy the CLE.
Hello, everybody. It is hard to not have an interactive conversation with people as we do this, but I guess technology creates us ready for this. So we will go through this. We have about an hour presentation and then time for questions. And those are coming through the chat function, right? So we'll roll along. What we're going to be focusing on today is looking at international, national, and territorial sources of children's rights and government's obligations to uphold them. And then the role of the Child and Youth Advocate Office and how that fits in with those obligations. And then we will also talk a little bit about child rights and family law matters, and ending with a tool that everybody can use to implement children's rights, which is called the Child Rights Impact Assessment. So just briefly, because we find that most often when we talk about children's rights and the role of the Child and Youth Advocate, even though it's been in place for 10 years, a lot of people still don't know what we do. The primary role of the advocate in the Yukon is to promote the rights and views of children and youth in Yukon government services and programs. And so the individual advocacy role is our primary role. Everything in our actions and activities is spelled out in the Child and Youth Advocate Act, which is a territorial legislation. We aren't a government department. It's an independent office that is as I said, my position is appointed by an all-party committee of the Legislative Assembly. So there's no reporting structure other than an annual report once a year. So the independence is really important for that. And then each jurisdiction in Canada has an advocate with a provincial territorial legislation, except NWT does not have one. And the legislation in Ontario was recently repealed about almost 2 years ago now. So they don't have individual advocacy in Ontario anymore, but the Ombudsman Office in Ontario is managing some of the systemic advocacy and the investigations of critical injury and death. And then PEI just got an advocate appointed this summer. So we do have 12 advocates across the country in some way, shape, or form. NWT is the only one that really isn't. And we do come together quite often. We work primarily on systemic themes because we all have our own independent role and jurisdiction, but we have a lot in common. So sometimes if there's an issue of national concern, we'll start addressing it. And the image on the screen is the report that we released last year on National Paper on Youth Suicide. So just to sort of give you an example of how we do work, we'll just give a scenario. So Riley's 14 years old and has been living with a grandmother since being removed from her mother's care at age 4. So Family and Children's Services in this case identified mother's home as unsafe and out-of-home care was required. So then she went to go live with her grandmother. And often these cases could be extended family care agreement or an informal arrangement. Then, you know, time goes on, there's not really a lot of oversight happening in that scenario. And at age 14, she ended up in the hospital with suicidal ideation and said she will not return to her grandmother's and actually said, I will kill myself if I have to go back. And that was part of the suicidal ideation. So these are this is a very typical type of case that we get with complex issues. And we looked at the different issues that are being brought to us and we put them through a child rights lens, and as well as the view of the child. So we actually saw 3 issues for this child. There is the mental health issue of suicidal ideation and making sure that she has the mental health supports that she needs. And she wants that. She wants to know why she feels horrible like this. She has the safety and protection issue. She's saying she's not going home. So we want to ensure that her home is safe and what kind of supports does the family need to protect her. And then the education issue as well. She was experiencing a lot of isolation and wasn't actually going to school at all, and said that she was technically homeschooling and she was registered for homeschooling, but wasn't actually learning anything. She said, I just signed the forms. So that's a type of case that we might get. There's many. We've had 1,000 over the last 10 years, 500 in the last 3 years, but we'll talk a little bit more about that so that you get a sense of what we deal with in the advocate office. And again, all of those issues are related to territorial programs. So lots of times people are like, what are children's rights? I mean, I grew up and children's rights weren't even in place yet, right? But the point of children's rights is that they are human rights, but they recognize that children have unique vulnerabilities. 25% of the population in the Yukon are children, but they don't vote, they don't really have a say, and they need a lot more support to promote healthy development. What we do for a child isn't just something that happens to them, it actually forms how they grow up. And they don't have a place to have a voice, so it's really important that the people that make the decisions consider the impacts on children in everything that they do, because it actually is changing society if we're changing how children grow up. The UNCRC came in 1989 and ratified in Canada in 1991. 195 countries in the world have ratified the UNCRC, and this is usually our fun moment where we're like, guess which one hasn't? USA, in case you didn't know. The UNCRC is our biggest convention that we look at for how children's rights are obligated by governments, but there's others. You know, there's a big long list of different declarations and conventions over the years. The ones that we focus on are the Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, because even the vulnerabilities are even more extreme. And then of course, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is something we pay close attention to in our office as well, because 70% of the kids in our work are Indigenous. Not just Yukon First Nations, we actually have a really high population of children we serve that live in the Yukon that are Indigenous but outside the territory. And as a Canadian Council of Child and Youth Advocates, we attended the closing ceremonies of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015. We made a declaration of reconciliation committing to making a difference for children and youth. The TRC calls for an implementation of UNDRIP and our most recent government, or the current government, the Liberals federally have committed to implementing under it. So there's something that we really think needs to be looked at alongside the UNCRC, so that as we implement and ensure that Indigenous rights are upheld, that they go hand in hand with children's rights. In our most recent annual report, which just came out last month, we created a little handbook, or sort of a little guide on children's rights. And so if you need a little bit more information, but there's that, but just really that it is for kids up to 18. There's 42 primary rights, and Articles 43 to 54 are for implementations of rights. There's general principles that really look at making sure that all children have access to these rights, regardless of their diversities, and that the best interest of a child is considered in all decisions that are made, and that the view of children is part of that best interest. Doesn't mean they make all the decisions, but it is part of the best interest. And on that view, we really focus on Article 12 of the UNCRC in the Child and Youth Advocate Office. Our tagline is "Young people have a voice," and that's our legislation states that that's what we do. So we meet children, we find their view, and we find that when young people have a voice and participation in decisions made about them, they are more likely to engage in the outcomes for those decisions, so that life isn't happening to them or about them, but with them. And then usually in the end, the kids actually want what's best for them. So it's the best way to work for kids, is to empower them that way. And that's a little bit about that. I guess I pass it over to Shauna for a second, right?
You want to slide you through?
I will, yeah. Here comes Shauna.
Hi. So Annette's been speaking about the international sources of children's rights, and I'm going to give a brief overview on the national sources of children's rights and then Yukon sources of children's rights. And just to say is that we know that we're passing a lot of information on, and we do plan to make this PowerPoint presentation available afterwards if you want to look at anything in more detail. So in terms of national sources of children's rights, there's just a few things that we do want to highlight. And the first is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that does apply to children, and that the jurisprudence says that it must be read in such a way that it's consistent with the Convention on the Rights of the Child from the United Nations. So that's important to know. A second major source of rights, if you will, is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which put out its calls to action. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission found that children's rights were violated in residential schools, and that children continue to be harmed as a result of the legacy of Indian residential schools. And that all of us Canadians can find ourselves in and between the 94 calls to action. A third major point that we want to speak about is the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls inquiry that was done, and the calls for justice that came out of that. And in particular, we want to draw your attention to Call for Justice 12.9, which called for the establishment of a child and youth advocate in every jurisdiction in the country, and even more so that there be a specialized unit on Indigenous children, or for Indigenous children and youth. Now, here in the Yukon, my understanding is that funding has not been provided for, or yet, for a specialized unit for Indigenous children and youth. However, we're very fortunate that Annette here has ensured that most of her staff in her office is Indigenous. So until that's formalized, that's how it's been implemented. And then out of that inquiry led to a call for the federal government to establish a National Child and Youth Commissioner. And that is currently in the form of Bill S-217, which is before the Senate right now. And the idea is that that national commissioner would act as a voice for children on the national stage. And then the last piece of law that we want to bring your attention to on the national stage is an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families. And that came into force just in January 2020. And if you recall, back in January 2018, there was a real public crisis about the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in child welfare. There was an emergency meeting with then Minister Jane Philpott, I believe, and Indigenous leaders a 6-point plan evolved out of that. And that's really what has resulted in this new piece of legislation. So it'll be really interesting to watch to see how that legislation is implemented on the ground and the difference that it can make. In terms of national jurisprudence, there's a seminal decision of AC in Manitoba, which is a 2009 Supreme Court of Canada decision. And there the court paid particular reference to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and particularly highlighted a couple articles from the convention, and that is Article 3, which talks about the best interests of the child, and Article 12, which enshrines the right of children to have their views and preferences heard in decisions made about them. We also want to highlight the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement from 2006. Jordan's principle is something that we talk about so often, which has really been enshrined in the decision of First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada, which is CARES, which we hear about so much in the news. And this came from a 2016 Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision, which found that the federal government had failed to properly implement Jordan's principle, which had resulted in discrimination against Indigenous children and youth on the basis of race and national ethnic origin. And since that decision in 2016, the federal government or the tribunal has issued 9 remedial non-compliance orders to the government of Canada for failing to comply with the order from that decision. And then finally, most recently of significance is the 60 Scoop class action lawsuits and settlement. In October 2017, an $80 million settlement was announced as a result. But I think it is important to note that I believe that still that Métis and non-status First Nation people have still been excluded from that settlement. So there's still a lot of work to be done in that area. In terms of Yukon sources of child rights, we have several pieces of legislation of significance in the Yukon. We have the Child and Youth Advocate Act, which Annette is going to go into much further detail about. We have the Child and Family Services Act, which really enshrines the best interests of the child and the rights of children to be heard in terms of their views and preferences when decisions are made about them. And it also talks about the rights of children in care. We have the Children's Law Act, which requires the courts to consider the views and preferences of children in making decisions about them, particularly as it relates to custody and access issues. We have the Education Act, which enshrines the right to education and free education and specialized education where required. We have the Young Persons Offences Act, which enshrines the protection of young persons, freedom from torture and healing. And for sure, if you canvass more legislation, there is more out there, such as in the Cannabis Control and Regulation Act. But we do want to mention that not all legislation specifically addresses the needs and the rights of children. And one that we do want to highlight is the Mental Health Act here in the Yukon, fails to give particular attention to child's rights and bringing forward the views and preferences of children. So there's still a lot of work to be done. And I'm going to pass it back to Annette here to talk about more of her work as the Child and Youth Advocate.
Okay. Thank you, Shauna. So in the role of the Child and Youth Advocate, it's not a complaints-driven type of role like the Human Rights Commissioner. We are looking for resolutions to advocacy issues. So when we get a call in, we put a lot of work into defining the issue, applying the rights, applying the Yukon government legislation that's relevant to the program or service, and then looking for what is the outcome resolution so that we can consider this issue kind of closed. So what happens in cases like kids like Riley, where they have so much complexity to an issue? In that case, or in cases sort of similar, that this kid was actually sent out of territory for mental health treatment because we don't really have a mental health unit here, and they needed more help. And down there, she disclosed again the harm that she was experiencing at home, and she was brought into care upon return to the Yukon. So she was actually sent home from the placement down south and then brought into care, put into foster care, group care, and started attending regular high school in the Yukon. Greatest outcome? Probably not. I would like to have seen a lot more supports be put in place right from the get-go at the point where the child was trying to explain what was going on in her life. But that's the kind of outcomes that we get sometimes. So again, we are mostly guided by the Child and Youth Advocate Act. In addition, we have a protocol signed with the Department of Health and Social Services and the Department of Education. Those are for sure the two departments in the Yukon government that we provide the most advocacy within. The protocol operationalizes the legislation and the roles that we do, because there's still a lot of confusion. Like every time we call, even after 10 years, they're like, what can I share with you? What am I allowed to talk to? And it's constantly changing, but we're really clear in how we do the work, and so that we can provide that information clearly, and that protocol helps with that. We apply the UNCRC to every single issue that comes to our office, and we have a database tracking that. Most issues have like 3 to 5 issues that are or rights that are applied. So it could be right to mental health, which could be a health right, but then it's also a healing right, right to have recovery, Article 39, as well as best interests, Article 3, and their right to have their view, Article 12. So usually there's a few different issues or rights that we would apply. And then we always keep in cognizant of TRC and UNDRIP for the Indigenous children, and we track that as well in our database. And as a council of advocates in the country, we've created a national advocacy standards. So we have 9 standards that we all try to adhere to as a group. Like, there's not really authority to that one, but that's part of our mission. As mentioned previously, our primary role is individual advocacy. This is not necessarily the case across the country. Other jurisdictions have different roles where they do a lot more systemic work and investigations. Ours is individual advocacy. So we meet with the children and youth. We hear what the issue is from their perspective. We promote their voice and view in the big government complex decisions that are happening for them. And if they are unable to share their view based on their developmental capacity, then we go to the rights. So that's why it's always really important that we understand the rights and how they apply. However, we do believe that there isn't an age on when a child has capacity to share a view, and young kids can tell you a lot. It's just about how you connect with them, and also with their natural advocates who know what's going on for them. And kind of how a case runs is through this flow chart. We do our mandate checking. We connect with the designated service, which would be a Yukon government department. And we also notify the First Nation unless somebody actively objects within the family. And our information sharing with the First Nation is really only about notifying of the issue. Although recently First Nations are so much more involved at decision-making tables. There's an element of collaboration with it, but it's not us sharing information with them. It's us sort of supporting the process as we help represent the child. We determine our advocacy actions based on the response from the government department and try to work toward a resolution. So we always try to think, what is it that we are hoping will come out of this advocacy issue for the child's best interest? And then we take our actions to determine that. The tool that we have the strongest in our legislation is information requests. So we can request records from any government department for the purposes of advocacy, and then reviewing those records helps us understand how decisions are made for the best interests of the child. Just a little bit about stats and where we're at with things. We just completed 10 years as of March 31st of operations in our office. So we're now 10 and a half years in. And every year we just have more kids coming to the office. 3 years ago, I thought it was an anomaly year. It just keeps getting busier and busier. So we really want to analyze what's going on, why we have so many new kids coming to the office, and as well as kids coming back with new issues. So we've had over 1,000 issues in 10 years now, and 500 of them have been over the last 3 years. So the slide that I have up right now shows how many new issues open a year. The dark one at the bottom is the number of new issues. And then the block on top is how many issues were carried over from previous years. it's massive for our tiny little office of 3 permanent employees. So we're expanding ever so slightly. We also take a lot of calls for things that are out of mandate or things that we don't take action for. And that's what we call informal advocacy. And that too keeps increasing. Typically over the first 8 years, I'd say most of those advocacy issues were for child custody matters. So people would call and saying, I'm going to court, or my kid doesn't want to live with the other parent anymore, help us. So I think we'll be talking about this a little bit more, but it's a lot about they need a child lawyer in the family court. That's not our mandate. Ours is to promote their views in Yukon Government Services. Also, we get calls from people that are concerned about kids, and they call us about an issue that isn't about a specific child. So they might call us about, homeless kids on the streets that aren't going to school, but they don't have a specific child that they're calling about. Or they might call us about things that we see in the ledge sometimes too, like type 1 diabetes isn't being addressed in the school system. Okay, well, tell us, and all of our cases, we have specific children that we are advocating for, so they don't fit within our mandate. So, but they're important issues and people care about them, so we track them just as an informal advocacy issue that isn't, we don't take action on. People often ask us, well, like, how long does it take to get a resolution? And it really varies. Like, we've had cases in the Department of Education that have lasted 2 hours and boom, done. We're like, hey, this kid needs, what's going on with this kid's school program? And they're like, oh, we'll just fix that, boom, boom, done. And then others have been going on for years and years and years, like kids that are in long-term, short-term placements for a long time, let's say. We call it permanency planning, where, they just don't really have a long-term plan or a family connection. So we're still working on a lot of cases at a systemic level. And when cases are open for a long period of time, like years, then we know that there's a systemic issue that needs to be addressed. And, most of the departments are responding fairly well with us on a lot of the issues. We've closed hundreds of issues. It's hard not to think about the 100 to 200 that are open right now, but because we have had so many issues over a long period of time and a lot of data, the way we're keeping it, we are really starting to see the systemic themes. And over the last couple of years, we've started ramping up our systemic advocacy. And we can do a full review of a systemic issue and provide advice to the department and follow up as well, asking for steps taken and ongoing follow-up with a review. Or we can just, if we don't have the resources, we can go out what we call section 12.2 and notify the department of an advocacy, a systemic issue, and request to be advised of steps taken. So we can say, hey, here's an issue, what are you doing? And then section 15 is a little bit different, but it's when a minister or the Legislative Assembly can make a request to us to do a full review and provide a report to them about an issue that they are concerned about. So those are sort of the 3 legislative ways that we address systemic advocacy. We have had 14 systemic advocacy issues over the 10 years, and we're really ramping up actively in about 6 of them, I'd say right now. There's quite a few for the kids in care system, like supporting extended families, prevention, all the way to aging out of care and what happens while kids are in out of home care. Then we are looking a little bit about the supports for families during COVID. We're definitely seeing the gaps widen in a lot of cases. We are dealing, always mental health is right, it was the first systemic issue we found in 2012, and we're still dealing with it, primarily access to mental health services in the Yukon. And then we looked at out of territory treatment, and we did a large review on the experiences of kids living in group care in 2019. That was released, Empty Spaces, Caring Connections. And we're still following up on that with the department as well. So lots has happened as a result of that. And then right now, our biggest systemic issue that we're dealing with is the barriers to kids attending school regularly. And we are quite active in collecting information right now for a review and report to the Department of Education in the spring. And we're not going to solve that issue by spring, but we are going to be able to give a sort of a lay of the land of the data that we've collected from children, youth, parents, educators, First Nations, communities, and the data source from the Department of Education, just to be able to describe what's going on from our perspective and from a child rights lens. Because there's lots of other things going on in the Department of Ed right now with the Auditor General report that came out last year as well. So this goes right alongside that. So lots of opportunity to participate in that. If you have anybody that's interested, let us know. The other part of our role, the sort of the third prong, is public education. And that's what this is right now, is sharing the role of our office with others. We've done a few big events to try to promote the role of our office, like our Jay's Care project. And we've done Global Child, which is a research project going to young groups of kids and doing focus groups about implementation of children's rights. We're working with the youth groups right now in the Yukon about developing a youth strategy, as well as developing youth interns to engage youth more. So there's a few different ways that we're doing public education. And then how we share information is often a question, and this is where lots of legal goes. And so we look at the legislation and our role that is defined by the Act. So we can collect information under Section 23 of the Child and Youth Advocate Act, and that is the primary way we collect information. We do it informally as well as formally, like when we can do a formal records request. But we just, like, even when we're notifying a department of an issue, we are informally requesting information. Anybody can provide information to the advocate, and they can do it as a referral, or they or as a request if we think we need it for the purposes of advocacy. We also can share information with Yukon government departments for the purposes of advocacy. So we can share the child's view. We try to maintain a high level of confidentiality and in how we keep records, but then we also have to share some information for those purposes. And in public education, we only share public information, and then we can share information with First Nations for notifying them of an issue, but we don't share information broadly than that. It's a little bit of a gap in our legislation in terms of collaboration or sharing information about some of our systemic issues that aren't already public. We don't really have the authority to do that other than to Yukon government departments. Lots of times people are a bit nervous to talk to us. They're not sure what they can share and what can happen. And we remind them that nobody can be penalized for providing information to the Child and Youth Advocate Office, and that anybody can share information, especially, and they must if we request it. The Child and Youth Advocate Act was passed in 2009. It actually came out of the Child and Family Services Act that was also passed in 2008. Right, David? I think, yeah. So a new Child and Family Services Act came out in 2008. And at that time, it stated that there will be a Child and Youth Advocate Act within 1 year. So in 2009, the act came into force, and it said that in 5 years, it will be reviewed. So my math would say 2014, maybe 2015, because the office didn't really open until 2010. And it's now 2020, and it still hasn't been reviewed. So we're working on that. We've provided a lot of information to the Member Services Board to conduct a review and to share our experiences to date. We are using the current legislation to its maximum potential, and there's a lot of things in this current legislation that work for us in terms of how we can advocate for children and youth. But we've also found some limitations in that, you know, we want to be able to share the reviews that we do publicly. We think it helps to accountability, it helps to follow through, and the public are interested, as you can tell by the number of people that call our office. We don't have an investigative mandate to deal with child death or critical injury, and that's something that's missing. Like, we're the only jurisdiction that doesn't have that. And we would like to enhance how we can share information ethically with others who are also doing work for the purposes of advocacy, so that we can, you know, be a little bit more united. We also can't act as legal counsel for children and youth, which I'm not saying we necessarily need to, but there's a gap there when it comes to promoting children's rights in the court systems. And I think that's partly why we're doing this workshop as well. It's something Shauna and I have talked about for about a year, about how can we, you know, connect so that children's rights are actually applied in all matters, because it's something we do every day, but it's not like people have a lot of different roles. So I think that's where we'll actually segue into next is family law.
So I have the great honor of providing legal support to Annette in her office when required, but I also practice a lot of family law. So in our conversations with Annette, we want to make sure that we not only talked about, that we really highlighted how the principle of upholding children's rights can be done in all of our work as lawyers, most obviously in the family law context, but that in all of our work, we should be considering whether there's an implication or a space for the rights of children to be upheld. With respect to family law, I want to highlight that there's really been an evolution in the law between long ago treating children really as property to the evolution to now recognizing that children have inherent human rights and that they must be upheld. And I think that the difficulty is that most often it falls on adults to uphold those rights, and that's as parents, that's as lawmakers, that's as the courts and as lawyers as well. And in the Yukon, when we're talking about children's rights, I have to say most often it's included in the principle of best interests of the child. And that includes in federal laws like the Divorce Act, but it also, you see it in all the other Yukon legislation, that's where it's embodied. So here I made in the slide made note of the decision of BLG and DLG. This is a 2010 decision from Madam Justice Martinson, who is sitting on our court here. And she affirmed that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child recognizes the right of every child to be heard in matters affecting them. So she really, if you're looking for a case to really speak about the power and the applicability of the Convention of the Rights of the Child in all matters affecting children, this would be a go-to case for you. I want to clarify the difference between a child advocate and a child lawyer, because there's still a lot of confusion about it. And that is because before the Child and Youth Advocate Act came into force in 2009, child lawyers were typically called child advocates in court. So when you're looking at older decisions, they will refer to child advocate, and then it still gets muddied even in more recent jurisprudence where we're probably not always as careful with our language as we should be. And just to clarify that the child advocate, currently Annette King here, that the office is a statutory body that's independent from government, and it advocates for children and youth in respect of receiving government services and programs. And to say that the child advocate cannot represent children in court and cannot be compelled to act as a witness in court, either in terms of evidence received from the child. Now, on the other end of the scale is a child lawyer, and the responsibilities and duties of a child lawyer were well articulated in the decision of Baxter and Benoit. And that was a 2004 decision from Mr. Justice Vail, where he articulated what the role of the child lawyer is in terms of representing the views and preferences of the child in court, so long as the child is able to provide those instructions. And finally, just to try and clarify things, we do often hear about child advocacy centers in the media. And these exist across the US and Canada. And typically, they're nonprofit organizations that bring together multi-services to try and provide wraparound supports for children. In the Yukon, for example, we have Project Links, which attempts to provide wraparound support for victims of crime who are under the age of 19. But just to say that that's separate from child advocates and child lawyers. In terms of Yukon jurisprudence on children's rights, I've already highlighted the first decision of Baxter and Benoit about determining whether a child has the capacity to instruct legal counsel. And the next one that I highlighted was the BLG and DLG, the 2010 decision of Madam Justice Martinson, which is an excellent decision and goes on length about the applicability of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And Justice Martinson said that the best decisions are arrived at when the voices of children are heard and due weight given to them. So I think that really opens the space for trying to include children in all decisions affecting them. And I think one of the things that I have to say that really causes me to pause and think is that in my work in family law, there's considered to be a cutoff in terms of presenting the views and preferences of children in the court in terms of being at least 10 years old. And what I find really fascinating in the work that Annette King and her office does is that they, through their skill set, are really able to obtain the views and preferences of children at a much younger age. So that is quite telling to me in terms of perhaps a further work that we could be doing in obtaining the views and preferences of the child and representing those in court when you have people who are qualified to get that evidence or obtain those views from such young people. And finally, there's the decision of RKK and BMM. And in that decision of Mr. Justice Gower, there was a mother who was trying to get a child lawyer appointed for a child who was autistic. And so the question was, is this child actually capable of giving instructions and stating their preferences? And what was really interesting in this decision, I think is of note and in the same theme, is that Justice Gower found that even though a child might be incapable of giving instructions or stating preferences, that doesn't mean they're disentitled from having a child lawyer appointed to them. Obviously, there's a bit more work to be done by the child lawyer in that respect in terms of interviewing other people in the child's life, but that shouldn't necessarily be a bar from upholding that child's rights to have their views and preferences heard. So I find that decision to be very powerful. Now I'm going to move it back to Annette to talk about how we can actually ensure that we are always assessing how we can best uphold children's rights in our day-to-day work.
Thank you, Shauna. Yes, so sometimes I ask myself, how do we get the numbers down? And what can we do so that we have less advocacy issues to deal with? And the answer is more people providing child rights and advocacy for children. You don't need to come to the Child and Youth Advocate Office to promote the view of a child. And the more we can teach self-advocacy for children and youth, that's great. The more everybody in a child's life understands it and helps promote those, greater. The more people that write the policies in the first place understand children's rights, the obligations of governments to uphold them, even greater. So that's what we're going to talk to now, is about how children's rights can be implemented in policy right from the onset. And the tool we have is a Child Rights Impact Assessment tool. It is kind of similar, if you're familiar with gender lenses, is putting a policy or legislation through the lens of children's rights and analyzing it with a tool so that before the policy is even approved or planned, then it can be like the outcomes of that policy, intended or unintended, and the impacts on kids will be considered. And that's what we're really going for now. An example I'll just give you that sort of goes from national to local is Federal Bill C-45, the Cannabis Act. When that started getting drafted, we had a few federal representatives contacting the Canadian Council of Child and Youth Advocates requesting our input on that act. And we provided some strong statements. We provided a letter to the Prime Minister as well as to our local premiers about our concerns about how that act impacted children's rights. And a lot of those were heard. There was roundtable sessions that we were invited to. There was an analysis of the UNCRC as they looked at it. And then locally, our Yukon Government Department of Justice responded to that request and brought me to a meeting and shared how they are making sure that children's rights are considered in the territorial policy, the Yukon Cannabis Control and Regulation Act. And there's quite a few features in it that did consider, like the age and where people could have cannabis, grow cannabis, sell cannabis, and considering that about children and youth. And those regulations went right to city bylaws. So in the city of Whitehorse, a cannabis retail location may not be within 100 meters of a youth organization or a school. And that satisfies us. We actually had a case where it was brought to our attention that a cannabis retail location was being looked at just half a block away from our office. And so then that gave us an opportunity to look at that. But also within our area, there is a youth serving organization as well, plus a bunch of daycares, but those don't seem to matter for that legislation. Anyway, so it was kind of an example where UNCRC Article 33 was considered at the national level, territorial level, and then also the municipal level. Was it perfect? No. Our council really wanted to address a few other things like edibles. We don't understand why cannabis needs to be in the shape of gummy bears, and we think that that creates a lot of risk for children. But overall, there was communication. Children's rights were applied and considered through this process. They even did youth participation consultations and things like that. So sort of just an example of how things can work on a regulation that's not really specifically about children, because it's not just about the things that are about children. So when we look at CREA, it's like, what does it actually do? You have the New Brunswick primer in the materials that we had recommended for reading. So New Brunswick is a province that applies CREA as a standard whenever they develop new policy and legislation. And the Advocate Office in New Brunswick plays a consultative role in supporting that process, not necessarily always doing the CREAs, and sometimes they do the CREA and sometimes they don't. In New Brunswick, some of them are publicized in whole or in part. We don't want doing a CREA and having it public being a reason to not do a CREA. So it's really important that, you know, we consider all of those things, and we are really calling for a Yukon CREA. We've had some interest in the Department of Health and Social Services to apply CREA in a more like policy way. The Director of Family and Children's Services is keen to do it, and we provided training last fall. UNICEF came up and provided the training, and we're working on sort of next steps for that. So it is a call to look at creating policies that have better outcomes for kids, so that we don't have to fix the problems later. You can predict the impacts by applying a CREA. And you can include children, and it creates a formal way to do it. We need to think of kids as not passive recipients of adult actions. They can actually be active participants in their lives. And they do hold rights, as we've reinforced a few different times. We find that CREAs actually play a big role in supporting minority and marginalized populations. So you can apply a CREA, you can also apply a gender lens at the same time, you can apply UNDRIP at the same time, and then you're hitting all the pieces that can really ensure that children's rights are upheld. There isn't a perfect CREA tool. We have a couple of models that are extremely simple to use. We'd like to see a Yukon application of that with a little bit more Yukon content, and to ensure that, you know, especially with self-governing First Nations, we want to make sure that a Yukon CREA tool considers our jurisdictional context. A CREA tool isn't a recipe that you just apply and stamp on, like computerized. You still need to look at professional judgment, analysis. So it does take a skill set. It's really a policy analyst's skill set, and lawyers would be great. You know, when you apply children's rights, you strengthen the case that you're trying to put forward. And, you know, if someone's trying to bring a case to the Child and Youth Advocate Office and convince us of something, talk children's rights, and we are more likely to listen. And so this is kind of a call out. If you're interested in getting involved in applying child's rights to Yukon legislations, let us know. We're going to be working on a working group to refine that tool in a Yukon way, and we will be able to hopefully get this put in so that we can solve problems before they start. Some of the messages that we give, particularly to Yukon government employees that we're advocating within their areas, is we say, like, know what your legislation is and the decisions that you're making, and why you're making those decisions based on your legislation, because that's what we're going to be asking as well. And tell us how you're upholding children's rights in the decisions that you're making. We don't always have to agree, or the child doesn't even always have to agree, but we need to sort of come to the table and all understand how things are happening. The more people understand what children's rights are, that we find the conversation is a lot smoother. And we also find that people whose rights weren't upheld when they were children have a harder time understanding how to uphold rights for children today. So sometimes it is an education thing, and we find that there's a lot of relief once people understand the impacts of intergenerational trauma and how children's rights were not part of that, and how we can do something better for our children today so that our future leaders, the children, will be able to make better decisions going forward. And, anyone who's been part of a youth group or engaged kids, like, it is one of the most inspiring things to talk to 12-year-olds about what they think should happen in the world. They know, and they are not, they don't have that lens of, oh, this is just how it is. They don't know that, right? So they are so creative. And I just encourage everybody to ask a young person some of the big stuff, because they have a lot of ideas. And I think that's going to take us to questions. We're doing pretty good for time, hey? So we have been, are there questions on that?
We do. We have two
Okay, so which
questions. Well, Annette, you sit there and
I'll
I'll
sit
ask
there.
you, I'll put you in the hot seat. So the first,
Okay.
the first question is, what does CREA stand for?
Oh,
We could
great.
just- Yes.
Child Rights Impact Assessments.
And the second question is, how do you uphold a child's rights in the context of self-government, where the Indigenous view might be different from the Eurocentric view of child's rights?
Mhm. Well, children there's 42 rights that we look at, and one of them, Article 30, is children's right to culture. So there is a place where we look at collective rights in the context of children's rights. And children have a right to parental guidance. So I don't think it would be completely separate from that. And I think it would be important to bring it all to the table and ensure that children's rights are part of the bigger decision-making process, not the only one, but part of.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And the only thing I would add to that is just the way that we are all required to take into consideration UNDRIP and all the work we do, and TRC and Missing Murdered Indigenous Girls.
Yeah.
To bring all those considerations, and I think your office does an amazing job of truly taking those into consideration.
Yeah, and it is a really good question, because I think sometimes it's kind of, people think it's one or, and it's like, how do you bring everybody to the table? And it's really an interesting time for me now, being almost 6 years in this position. And when I started, it was really hard to get the First Nation at the table, because it just was sort of an afterthought or like tokenized. And now we're seeing the First Nation at the table a lot more. And so previously it was us working with the First Nation, really trying to promote children's rights in an Indigenous context. And so it's really shifting in that, because we are seeing First Nations as much stronger partners now in decisions being made.
Okay, the third question is, what reoccurring issues or themes does your office deal with?
Oh, goodness. Well, yes. Those are kind of the systemic issues that we see. In the school setting, we are seeing reoccurring issues of kids who need educational supports and behavioral supports, families needing more support. Over COVID, we found that was a really big issue in terms of kids they were at home in the spring instead of at school, so all their supports weren't with them. They didn't come home with them, but the problems did sometimes. We're seeing a big trend right now with families supporting children and youth, so that kids aren't in care anymore, but out-of-home care might be required. So we have a very big theme of kids who do not live with their parents, but live with maybe other family members. And what those supports look like is really shifting. Yukon government's being less intrusive, and the supports are being less direct, and expecting the First Nation and the family to step up and do a lot more. So those are kind of the main themes, I would say. There's so much more access to mental health and experiences for the kids aging out of care, homelessness. We see a lot of the different themes.
Yeah, I have a question for you. So if Yukon government wanted to implement a CREA process or framework like they've done in New Brunswick, where would they start?
I would think they'd start by looking at the CREA tools that are out there and developing a tool that works best for the Yukon. And then providing training through UNICEF and the support of our office. Training is quite simple to develop, and I'm trying to work with UNICEF to get a training tool online where we could keep doing that and build off the policy training that's already been in place. And then create criteria that is relevant to the Yukon so that we can apply it to legislations as they go. And then some sort of terms of reference or a plan on what the role of the Child Advocate Office could be in that process. Yeah.
Do you get asked to be involved in involved with children when there's an active family law case? And if so, does that present difficulties?
Thank you. I don't, if you didn't hear what David said, he's asking if we get asked to be involved in family law cases. And the big answer is yes. We get all sorts of calls, like on the informal advocacy slide, that's probably the #1 reason we get calls that are out of mandate and we don't take action. But there are a lot of cases that we deal with in our office where we did open an issue and we're actively involved because there's a protection element to the family law case as well. So it's often, here's a trend lately, so maybe kind of always, but really big lately, is that there's a protection issue with one of the parents. So, and the other parent is very concerned about the safety on the other end of the joint custody arrangement. And that parent isn't sure what they should do. And so then so we might open an advocacy issue stating that we want to make sure that, that the protection is dealt with. So we'll check in with Family and Children's Services on what's being put in place to ensure that child's protected. Did they do an investigation? What's the outcome? What's the recommendations? But if there's a protective parent on the other side, sometimes they don't do much more there. So we're kind of calling for more family supports on one end of the custody case because it's kind of two households, right? But yeah, we get asked to be involved a lot. And so we're really working with Family and Children's Services to figure out where we fit and where we don't, because we're not here to deal with the custody, we're here to deal with the protection. Yeah, and we don't go into family law. We make a lot of referrals to FLIC. Yes. Yeah.
And just a follow-up to that, do you ever have discussions with lawyers for children or child lawyers at all, or that?
No, it's funny you say that because I'd really like to. So David asked if we ever have discussions with child lawyers. We know enough to know how they are appointed because we get asked that question a lot. So the information that we share, so please call me if I'm wrong, is that a court will appoint a child lawyer upon request of one of the applicant, possibly. The child can't be their own applicant because we have young people coming to our office as well requesting to go to court for a custody transfer. That's not an option. We tell them that they need to talk to a lawyer or to go to FLIC. We are dealing with so many individual issues that keep us so busy, and then the systemic issues. But one of the things I'd really like to do one day is a knowledge day, like a knowledge sharing day about all the different people that deal with child custody and family law, and really clarify who does what and how, because these families are struggling and the kids this isn't just an issue that we fix and then, like school, get an EA, they have their educational supports. This is chronic. This is their whole life. We're talking till they're 18 kind of thing, where they're living in this sometimes toxicity because nobody really knows how to solve what's going on in terms of this custody disputes. So sometimes the referral actually becomes a mental health referral as well. Yeah.
So I've got something related to that, a question for you, and that is that, so we've talked about how the UN
There you go.
conventions on the rights of the child and legislation and cases suggest that children have a right, not suggest, they state that children have a right to be heard in all decisions affecting them. In our court system here in the Yukon, generally a child lawyer won't be appointed if the child is younger than 10.
Mhm.
But as I said, I noticed in your work
Mhm.
that you're able to do a lot of work in terms of exploring the views and the preferences of children under the age of 10. So how do you go about doing that? Or what kind of expertise would someone need to have? Would a child lawyer be sufficient? Do they need more training to try and obtain the views and preferences of a child under the age of 10
Mhm.
to a degree that they could be presented in court as evidence that could be relied on? Or what's your advice there for
Yeah.
that area that we're dealing with?
So a child lawyer might not even be appointed if they're younger than 10?
Yeah.
Because for me, my understanding of a child lawyer is that they're there to promote the rights, not just the view. And so I would want a child lawyer to be appointed to ensure that the UNCRC is applied. And because there is it's a third party at the table, if it's family law, each parent has their own perspectives, and the child's is a whole separate perspective that needs to be considered. And our legislation clearly articulates that if we are unable to get the view of a child due to their developmental capacity, that we must ensure the rights are our focus. So if it's we've had newborns referred to us, so we don't ask them what they think. We can't, right? But we ensure that their rights are upheld, and we look at the government policies and legislations as they relate to that child's well-being, and we ensure that those are being considered. And that's what I would recommend for that as well. But also developmentally, there's a lot of people that work with young people, like the Child Development Center would be a great resource for anywhere up to the age of 6. And we also really try to engage with natural advocates. So if that is an appropriate thing in the legal system, to engage with somebody who does know the child really well, that's somewhat neutral and has that capacity to engage with a young person, that would work. I don't know how else they could do. Like therapists sometimes have a lot to help a child. So there's times where we'll connect with a child and we just know it's gonna, we don't have the time to meet them 6 times and build a relationship and get their view. But we say, well, maybe if your counselor came with you, we'd understand a little bit more, and then they kind of work it like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We have another question here is, do you ever get asked for input on criminal cases?
Well, not in court, because we actually legally cannot be involved in court. But when a child is a victim of a crime and there's a charge before the court, then we could get asked more in terms of accessing services, and we definitely care about what happens with Project Links and the coordination of services. And when there's a criminal case and the child's the victim, then there's naturally a child protection issue, right? So we might be looking at what kind of services and support's happening there, but we wouldn't go to the court. The other way in a criminal case is youth justice. So we definitely have a lot less youth justice cases, David, but that is kids involved in the Youth Criminal Justice Act and the Young Persons Offences Act fit our mandate, and we ensure that their rights are upheld in that process, but not as their lawyer. So they would always have their lawyer that's representing them in the justice and in the court, and then we would be more supporting them with some of the other things around. And even sometimes with youth justice, we find the biggest issue is knowledge of rights, and young people just want to even know what their rights are, and then we promote those. Yeah. Again, access to services is often one of the things. We're a referral source sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about National Child Day, which is coming up?
Thank you. So National Child Day is November 20th every year since 1989. And it is the day of the year that children's rights are recognized across the country. So our Canadian Council will be providing a statement on that day. We'll do some media. In our office, Benji Klethro, our deputy advocate, started a open house each year about 7 years ago, I'm going to say. So we do our annual open house on National Child Day, what we're going to do this year, not an open house. So I'm not sure what we're going to do. But we are going to do some media, and we're going to really celebrate the implementations of children's rights. You know, looking at our data, we've complained 1,000 times about how rights are not being upheld. And we want to use this National Child Day as a time to celebrate children's rights. And that's why I like Korea too. It's just so much more positive in terms of actually creating outcomes rather than concerns. The other thing that we've been doing is a lot more social media. So if anyone's into Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, follow us on those. You can access them through our website, ycao.ca. And we've started a Instagram video series called Global Action Local Voices, where we have a young person, Max Zimmerman, promoting children's rights and asking questions from adults as well as young people about how children's rights are being implemented. So we'll be doing a lot more with Max during National Child Day as well for that.
Annette, earlier in your slides, you went over the statistics of your office and just showed us this exponential increase in the number of cases coming forward, or children coming forward seeking your advocacy. I'm wondering if you could give us an idea of what your theory is as to why it's grown so much, and how do you handle 564 new clients in 1 year when you have 3 staff? If you could tell us about that. Yeah, so why do you think it's grown so much? Or
it has. So looking at this chart, well, I started in 2015, and at that time I could see that we needed to mend some relationships and working relationships, and I did a lot of outreach and public education right in the first year. And so I thought that was why, but then it just kept growing. So, you know, it's really hard to know for sure. Is it because the more cases you get, the more you're going to get because people share that information, right? The same kids keep coming back for more. But I also think it is because of the lack of capacity. We only had 3 staff until this year, really. We had a 4th staff in 17-18, but then we didn't have them in 18-19. No, the other way. We had them in 18-19. We didn't have them in 19-20. And so this year, it's just that, like, I really needed to get a little bit more capacity, because the more that we are dealing with the fires of each individual issue, we're not addressing them systemically. And now that we are really in a place where we understand the systemic issues a lot better, we're able to take the time to analyze them from our data. I'm hoping that as we deal with things systemically, the numbers will eventually get down. And again, we want to go to the before the train tracks start, is if we applied children's rights right from the get-go, then we wouldn't have the systemic issues, and then we wouldn't have so many individual advocacy issues. Yeah.
And could you tell us, I think it's this slide, how are you dealing with 564 new clients? I think for most of us lawyers, we can handle 10% of that. So how?
It's
how are you doing that?
amazing.
Yeah.
Well, you know, you hire staff that are really, really dedicated. Because they are. It's like they give their hearts and souls, and we can't work triaging and waitlisting. It just doesn't work like that. But it's really challenging, and I think that's why we have so many open issues still, is that, you know, we can get to the point where we notify the departments of all the issues, but it's really hard to take the time to actively advocate and get you know, effective resolutions for each of those issues. But yeah, we do have dedicated work, and that's why we need to do presentations like this. We can't do it all ourselves. We need other people to help. Yeah.
Another question, forgotten now. Any other questions out there that you'd like to submit? There's a question. I should check the chat function. Chat, no. Got the.
And it doesn't have to end here. People can contact us for more questions, Shauna or myself, or conversation.
Yeah, I think that's about it. I think we could probably wrap it up.
Anything else?
Great.
Do you want to show your face to close?
No, that's okay.
David says no, so we'll do the closing.
Thanks, everyone.
And again, yeah, do talk to a child on National Child Day. Just ask them a question about anything that, oh, this is just going to keep rolling.
Yeah.
But again, we always do appreciate evaluation and feedback. So it can be a quick email to my office, annette.king@ycao.ca, or to David even, right?
And the
Before.
survey went out.
And the survey did go out. Great. We really appreciate that because we ask people to do better and we want that for ourselves as well.
And are we sharing our PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, so our PowerPoint presentation
Be on our website.
will be on the presentation itself will be, right? But also we have our PowerPoint presentations with notes pages with a little bit more detail, so we're happy to send that out as well. We'll give it to Lynn.
It'll go on the website as well.
Excellent.
Okay.
All right, any closing remarks?
No, that's it.
thank
Just
you.
thank you so much.
Yeah.
And we hope this is the start of an ongoing conversation about upholding children's rights.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
Yeah,
Annette.
thank you, Sean.
Yeah,
We've been
thanks,
planning this for
David.
so long.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Bye.
David.
Thank